Okay, well, I'd like to welcome everybody who's just joined us. My name is Richard Cullen, and I'm the convener of the Taxation Law Research Program here at Hong Kong University. And we're very pleased today to have Dr. Yan Zhu, Professor Yan Zhu from University of New South Wales in Australia, talking to us. And the TLRP seminar today, as you can see on screen, is a multilateral agreement on carbon pricing and implications for developing countries. Let me just say a few words before asking Yan to start the presentation of introduction. Yan Zhu is now a Scientia Associate Professor in Tax Law at the University of New South Wales in the Business School. In fact, she was a postdoctoral fellow here at Hong Kong U, and she's now an adjunct professor, again with us. When she left us after her postdoctoral time, she went to Chinese University of Hong Kong, where she was a tenured associate professor before she moved to Australia to this new, quite prestigious appointment at UNSW. She has been in the past a Fulbright senior research scholar in the US, had various other scholarships to travel, and she's presented internationally on a range of topics, and she's a recognised expert internationally, certainly on Chinese taxation law, more specifically perhaps on green taxation law, which is what we're talking about today, but also the operation of the VAT in China. I think that's enough from me for the moment, so I'll ask Yan now to start the presentation, and thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Many thanks, Richard, for the introduction, and also many thanks for inviting me to present in the tax program. I'm really honored by the invitation. Yes, I think somehow the seminar time, the timing of the seminar may be good, because just very recently we finished the COP26. COP26 attracted the whole world's attention. The process and the final outcomes of the summit have been discussed widely. One thing that is worth noting relates to that rules to create a framework for a global carbon market were approved. However, details of the global framework are not yet available. In today's topic, my presentation today will discuss the idea of a multilateral carbon pricing framework and the implications for developing countries. The purpose of this talk or this research is to consider pathways of a global carbon pricing framework as a way to effectively convert government pledges of emissions reduction into real actual action. And in the presentation, I will firstly discuss why carbon is special and how to deal with it, and then examine the status of carbon pricing mechanisms. Building upon this examination, I explore the options for a multilateral carbon pricing framework and conclude a global minimum carbon price may be promising, but for it to work, some supplementary measures may be needed, and the interests and the needs of developing countries must be considered. Why carbon is special? The answer is apparent. Greenhouse gas emissions, particularly emissions from carbon dioxide and the primary greenhouse gas emitted through human activities, pose a common serious threat to all people on the planet. Just in the summer alone, we saw disastrous weather events from Europe to Asia, and these two pictures were from the heavy rains in Zhengzhou, and then finally to North America. The planet is already 1.1 to 1.3 degrees warmer than it was in the pre-industrial time. and the concentrations of carbon dioxide would send the planet on the track to be 2.7 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial baseline by 2100, according to some recent study. Well, the impacts of warming up to and above 1.5 degrees and some potential effects of mitigation measures required to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees a factor or such impacts and the effects fall disproportionately on the poor and the vulnerable. As pointed out in a 2018 special report issued by the IPCC, the message is just re-emphasized in the latest IPCC report. And the latest IPCC report also warns the window for limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is significantly narrowed. Clearly, it's urgent to close the gap between rhetorical commitments and actual action if the common goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is to be reached, and it is imperative to do it in an equitable way. The latest IPCC report says it is vital to achieve 100% of carbon emissions reductions, and that is carbon neutrality by 2050. This requires a global effort. Carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way among a number of policy instruments to cut emissions. It can take different forms, and most commonly a carbon tax or an emissions trading system, and briefly ETS. Carbon pricing puts a price on carbon dioxide emitted and to make those who are responsible for damages caused by emissions to pay for the social costs. A number of jurisdictions have announced an updated and ambitious carbon emissions reduction goal, and some have taken legislative measures to implement carbon pricing, either a carbon tax or an ETS, or a combination of both, and to achieve mitigation targets, although more needs to be done with actual enforcement. For carbon pricing to work as the most cost-effective way to mitigate emissions, it needs to be applied at a credible price level everywhere. Despite the prospect that the carbon pricing offers the cheapest way to cut emissions, its global reach is still very limited. As this slide shows, there are currently 64 carbon pricing initiatives, which cover only 45 national jurisdictions, while some of the initiatives are taken at the subnational levels. The table here, the table on the chart in this slide, and also in the following slides, show countries with carbon pricing measures. As can be seen from these slides, currently carbon pricing measures are mainly applied in developed countries, and none of the poorest developing countries has adopted such measures. The term developing countries is used very often, but there is no uniform definition on it. So to more accurately examine the situations of these countries, in the research, I used the World Bank categorization of countries by income group to refer developing countries to those that are defined as either low or lower middle or upper middle income, measured by gross national income per capita. The initial research findings are striking, while the majority of countries with carbon pricing are high income economies, and that is developed countries. There are still a number of developed countries, such as Australia, that don't have a carbon pricing measure. These developed countries are responsible for around 31.3% of global carbon emissions. By comparison, lower middle income countries with carbon pricing only contributed around 3.7% of carbon emissions. Moreover, carbon prices in the covered jurisdictions vary significantly. ranging from below 50 cents to around $137 as of April 2021. Many jurisdictions' carbon prices are below the price range of $40 to $80 per ton required in 2020 to reach the goal of limiting global warming. This slide shows carbon prices in China. With the rolling out of the national ETS in China in early 2021, China has now had the world's largest carbon market. However, as you can see from this slide, the carbon prices in China are very low. The US doesn't have a national carbon price. Most carbon pricing developments in the US are taking place at the subnational level. And these include, for example, California, Massachusetts, and the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI. And the prices range from $6.5 to around $18. This is in sharp contrast to the price range in the EU and the UK. In the EU, the EU ETS has set a carbon price of around $50. With further carbon pricing measures adopted in some EU member states, carbon prices in the EU can be as high as $137. Actually, that is the price adopted in Sweden. In the UK, with its official departure from the EU and the EU ETS at the end of 2020, the UK ETS has come into operation since 2021. The UK ETS closely resembles the EU ETS. It has an additional carbon tax with a price level of around $25. Some countries that are not major carbon emitters have adopted carbon pricing to reduce emissions. And Canada is such a country, which stands again in contrast to the US. Although, like the US, Canada doesn't have a national carbon price, and the various subnational carbon pricing measures in Canada have imposed the carbon prices notably higher on average than the prices in the US. This slide shows countries' statistics about countries without carbon pricing. Significantly, around 70% of the 189 World Bank member countries have not adopted any carbon pricing measure. The total carbon emissions by poorest countries among this group are almost negligible. That is below 0.4% of global carbon emissions. The majority of countries without carbon pricing are lower middle income countries, and they are responsible for around 13% of global carbon emissions. India stands out in these low middle income countries. These countries may have concerns about economic impacts of a domestic carbon pricing measure. So some supplementary measures are needed if we want to encourage more developing countries, and especially those very poor, to introduce carbon pricing. One way to address their concerns is to provide financial support together with the technologies and management skills from developed countries to developing countries. Actually, the commitment of $100 billion per year by developed countries is a central part of the Paris Agreement. In COP26, developed countries have agreed to double funding for developing countries by 2025. And the thing is whether developed countries can deliver on their pledge. In a nutshell, the current application of carbon pricing has two major limitations. First, it is limited to a small portion of countries, and most developing countries at the lower income ends do not have one. And second, carbon prices in many covered jurisdictions are far too low to limit global warming. to well below 2 degrees. Obviously, much more needs to be done. A global carbon pricing framework would help reach the goal of limiting global warming. In theory, there are 3 options: a universally applied carbon tax, an adoption of emissions trading schemes by all jurisdictions with annual progressively tightening of emissions targets, and a global minimum carbon price. There are 2 major obstacles. There are two major obstacles with the first 2 options. And that is the difficulty of reaching a global consensus among 195 signatories to the Paris Agreement, and the uncertainty about creating a carbon price level that is high enough to achieve reduction targets, and especially when the options are applied in a way that pays no or little regard to the interests and the needs of developing countries. So this leaves the option to a global minimum carbon price or an international carbon price floor, as proposed by the IMF. A global minimum carbon price, as the one proposed by the IMF, puts a floor on carbon prices across large emitters and allows flexible accommodation of domestic non-pricing policies, so long as they achieve the equivalent emissions reductions to pricing. A global minimum carbon price does not mean it is itself a carbon tax, and certainly such a price floor can be easily applied under a tax. However, it can also be applied under an ETS or through non-pricing regulations, such as standards on fuel quantity. The IMF proposal has 3 design features. First, it is limited to several large emitters, at least at the initial stage. And secondly, it provides differentiated price floors for countries depending on their development level. And the third, it allows flexible accommodation of reduction instruments that go beyond carbon taxes and emissions trading schemes. These design features are intended to overcome the difficulty of reaching a global agreement among a large number of countries and the uncertainty about creating a globally credible carbon price, and through setting out a lower price for developing countries and allowing flexible reduction policies. However, it's not very clear whether this proposal can be accepted by the small group of large emitters targeted in the proposal, and that is China, India, and the EU, and the US. India, as a lower middle income economy, doesn't have a carbon tax or an ETS. However, I should note that India has a coal tax that may lead to some carbon emissions reduction. The US would have to introduce a federal level measure to oblige those states without the carbon pricing to introduce one. It is also not clear whether the 4 targeted emitters would accept the respective price floor suggested in the IMF proposal. So there are 3 price floors suggested in the proposal. As you can see here, the highest price floor, $70 for advanced economy such as the US, and $50 for upper middle income, upper middle economy such as China, and the lowest price floor of $25 for low income economies such as India. For example, the price floor of $50 suggested for countries like China would be considered too high by the Chinese government to be accepted. The US may also not like the price floor of $75 suggested in the proposal. And further, the multilateral framework on minimum carbon prices may be over time extended to more countries, including developing countries. However, there may be a question as to whether developing countries in particular would accept the imposition of such a minimum carbon price, and since it may drive investors to countries that don't have that measure. It's also unclear how much revenue the measure might raise. Lastly, the European Union, the EU. The EU might accept the price floor of $70 because currently it has a price of nearly $50. And some European members have a price well above $75. But the EU may be anxious that without necessary sanctions on non-enforcement or non-compliance, and the adoption of a multilateral agreement on minimum carbon prices would not be meaningful. So this raises an issue, that is the minimum price option, even if it were the ideal solution, would not be pursued unless there were sanctions for non-compliance. Without sanctions, international treaties would be somehow just insertions of what countries pledge they will do, and often with no intention of delivering on their pledges. Some further actions may be needed to facilitate the development and implementation of a multilateral agreement on carbon pricing. If it's not possible to create direct sanctions on non-compliance under such an agreement, proxy sanctions may be necessary, and the border carbon adjustments may be optimal proxy sanctions. Actually, such a sanction has been very recently adopted in the European Union as a part of its Green Deal. BCA's border carbon adjustments are, as we know, unilateral actions. Because of this, they have been considered the second best option to improve emissions reduction measures after internationally agreed coordinated agreements. And BCAs are designed to equalize the costs borne by domestic industries with those incurred by producers in jurisdictions without comparable carbon policies. BCAs are meant to address the two major concerns of those jurisdictions imposing domestic carbon pricing policies, and that is carbon leakage and competitiveness. Carbon leakage, simply put, refers to the situation in which businesses move production from countries imposing climate policies to other countries with weaker or softer emission constraints. The competitiveness concern is due to that domestic industries, particularly those carbon intensive and trade exposed industries, have to bear the cost of carbon emissions, and as such, they will be put under a competitive disadvantage compared with foreign businesses incurring no such costs. Another very often mentioned rationale for BCAs is the so-called leverage, and that is the adjustment mechanism may incentivize foreign jurisdictions to introduce comparable reduction policies. Currently, apart from the EU, several other jurisdictions, including the US, have announced their consideration of introducing a BCA. In a way, BCAs could be used by jurisdictions with stringent reduction policies as a safeguard against setbacks in international climate negotiations and against non-compliance under international agreements. However, if BCAs are to be used as proxy sanctions under a multilateral agreement on carbon pricing, two aspects of legal issue need to be considered. First, what implications WTO law and the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and have for BCAs? And second, to what extent can BCAs be aligned with both systems, considering the circumstances in which a multilateral agreement on carbon pricing exists? In terms of WTO law, the most relevant are the non-discrimination principles and the explicit exemption for border tax adjustments of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, so briefly GATT, where a BCA is imposed in connection with a carbon tax, and it would be determined as a border tax adjustment. Article 2.2a of the GATT clearly explicitly allows a border tax adjustment. However, if a BCA is linked to an ETS, the measure may constitute the internal regulation under GATT Article 3.4, which requires national treatment. Moreover, the measure needs to meet the requirement of most favored nation treatment under Article 1. The two articles embodying the non-discrimination principles are at the core of the international trade law. For the purpose of a multilateral agreement on differentiated minimum carbon prices, the most relevant non-discrimination principle is probably the most favored nation obligation. BCAs that are aligned with the agreement would conflict with the most favored nation obligation because they apply differential treatment to imports on the basis of a country of origin. And the most favored nation obligation would preclude favorable treatment for developing countries. Nevertheless, the BCAs may still be legal if they fall within GATT Article 10 on general exceptions. Article 10b and g can be invoked to justify BCAs that would violate either of or both the national treatment and the most favored nation obligation if they are applied to protect the life or health or relate to the conservation of natural resources. Under both exemptions, the relevant measures must further satisfy the requirements of the shuttle of Article 10. Effectively, the shuttle of Article 10 is intended to ensure that the measures in question are applied to protect legitimate interests, and in the case of BCAs linked with climate change, legitimate interests in the environment. And they should not be applied as disguised restrictions on international trade. Therefore, preferential treatment on minimum carbon prices for developing countries may be justified under the shampoo of Article 10, considering the situations, the conditions in developing countries are not comparable to those in developed countries. The consideration of BCAs by developed countries is inevitably linked to the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So briefly, the CBDR. The principle is explicitly referenced in both the UNFCCC and the Kyoto Protocol. It is also articulated in the Paris Agreement, albeit with an addition of in light of national circumstances. And there has been some criticism of the addition in the Paris Agreement. But because of the time limit, I will just skip that. And the precise meaning of the principle of the CBDR, the principle, in particular, the basis of the requirement of differentiation, remains unclear. However, the principle does suggest it is necessary to consider the different historical responsibility for climate change by developing countries and the relevant capacity of countries to address such issue. So as a whole, conflicting requirements appear to exist between international trade law and the international environmental law. And in respect of the design of unilateral border carbon adjustments, the tension illustrates some underlying conceptual problems with the two systems of international law. And that is international trade law concerns trade liberalization and therefore efficiency. Whereas international environmental law focuses on the environment and the share of each country to the global reduction effort and therefore equity. However, it's possible to design a BCA that allows developing countries to have a differential treatment to be compatible with WTO law through liberal interpretations of the general exception in Article 10. The outcome, on the other hand, is not certain. So before I finish the presentation, I just wanted to say a bit about the BCAs and the feasibilities and the necessity of BCAs and a multilateral agreement on minimum carbon prices. Let's say if a multilateral agreement on minimum carbon prices can be put in place, would the justification for unilateral BCAs remain? I would argue that the justification would significantly diminish because multilateral approaches are strongly preferred over unilateral actions. BCAs should only be used as a last resort in cases of non-compliance regarding the obligations specified in a global agreement on minimum carbon prices. The general exceptions in Article 10, particularly the chapel, could guide the design of BCAs to align with the multilateral agreement with differentiated minimum carbon prices, and at the same time, to satisfy WTO rules and the principle of CBDR. The value of BCAs, I think, lies in their practical role in facilitating the development and the implementation of a multilateral agreement on carbon pricing. The value should not be overstated. Ideally, the mechanism will just serve as a deterrent and will not be invoked by participating countries. In the long term, the most desirable solution to the collective challenges of climate change is collective climate action. BCAs will never be a desirable nor stable solution in the long run. So to conclude, I would think a global minimum carbon price is a promising measure to help scale up carbon pricing measures globally and to achieve the goal of limiting global warming to below 2 degrees. But the challenges are had and the complementary actions and measures may be needed, at least in the short term, to make the measure work. And so that's the end of my presentation. And thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much, Yan. It's a lot of information, but very concisely and clearly presented. We've got a little bit of time available if there are any questions. I'm looking at the screen here, and I don't see anybody has, I think, put up a question yet, but maybe they'll come. I had a couple of questions myself. I must say it was very informing to me because I haven't been paying attention to this issue very much, not as much as I should have. The complexity, I'm not surprised to hear the complexities. As you rightly point out, you've got all of these different nations with different sorts of priorities, concerns about poverty reduction or retaining their, current economic advantages and so on and so forth. And then you've got overlapping concerns arising out of the WTO and so on. I think one of the questions that occurs to me, and I'm hoping you might be able to make some comment on this based on the work you've done and the research you've done. As I look at all of these measures, ETS, carbon taxes certainly, and particularly these border carbon adjustments, what do you think the implications here for inflation? Because these all are going to impose additional costs on the products being produced, and particularly the BCAs, because if we look, for example, at the role of China and its just a huge dominant role in providing all manner of goods and services to the entire globe. I saw some figures recently just for the US. The amount of importing from China has just continued to go up and up and up for all manner of consumer goods, notwithstanding the tariffs being applied. And this is already producing inflation concerns. So I'd be interested in your thoughts. It's off the territory a bit, but I think it's important. Any comments?
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. This is really a very good question, but somehow I think it's a little bit beyond my capacity. It requires an economist to answer the questions, but I will try. I think currently the inflation can be seen in many countries. And the US is a very typical example at the moment. And I see inflation here in Australia as well. And the people in China, probably people in Hong Kong also see inflation and to varying degrees. I think there must be a lot of reasons explaining the current inflation, the rise in inflation rate. I'm not sure about the role of border carbon adjustments in pushing up inflation rates in many countries. It might have pushed some bit, but I'm not sure about the extent. At the moment, inflation has been pushed up by many factors, such as the disruption of global supply chain and the rise in labor costs in China, and also business under pressure of getting under pressure to get electricity, power, etc. So many reasons, many factors may explain the current increase in inflation. I think over time, inflation rate may be controlled. But in terms of just come back to border carbon adjustments, I'm really not sure about the extent. The European Union has just announced it's going to impose border carbon adjustments, but it haven't really started doing that. So the effect of border carbon adjustments on inflation remains to be seen. And yeah, but at the moment, I'm really sorry, I couldn't really tell the impact. It may be having impact because in a way, border carbon adjustments just like a tariff. So yes, it's like a normal tariff. And when you have a tariff, and then domestic prices would be pushed up. So that is a kind of a common thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely, it is a huge issue. It can be a huge issue. Yeah.
And it occurs to me, just listening to you, that we're talking about all of these impositions BCA, carbon taxes, and so on. This discussion has progressed during a time of record low inflation. And record low interest rates as well, produced by, especially, as I understand it, one of the reasons is the central banks, especially the US central bank, just keeps producing money. So there's so much money floating around, it tends to stop the need for interest rates going up. But now, and I'm no economist either, but these inflation is starting to gain some traction. The environment is changing, and I'm thinking if indeed inflation does, at least become set in place at a higher level, it's got to be somewhat more difficult to talk about these further taxes being applied, or these further impositions anyhow being applied, because they are going to generate revenue. That's the other thing, whether it's a border carbon adjustment or whatever. And so that revenue could be used to reduce the impact of the inflation in some way. But as we know, the transaction costs involved in that sort of action are very high usually, and rather imprecise. So I suppose we can just flag it as something that could well become part of this discussion. And
definitely. Sorry to interrupt you. I was going to say, and sorry, really sorry, but I just wanted to make a comment based on what you just said. And definitely that can have an impact on domestic discussion of what measures, what kind of measures the national or the federal government can take to address climate change, and at the same time satisfying the domestic constituents' appetite or preference, and also making sure, especially for democratic countries, making sure the incumbent government will be okay with their next election. So yeah, that definitely will be some domestic impact of introducing or having a carbon tax, or having a border carbon adjustment, etc. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's good. Look, I notice we've now got 2 questions. So if you, as I have just done, click on the Q&A button, you'll see there's one from Wilson Chow and another one from Juki Hong. Perhaps you'd like to respond to those.
Sure. Yeah, I will try to answer Wilson's question first.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you very much for the questions. Actually, there were 2 questions. So first is, do you think it's necessary to have some incentive for countries to buy in? If so, what may such an incentive will be? I would suggest that's really a good question. When we talk about measures to combat, to address climate change, countries tend to have this so-called carrot and stick approaches at the same time. Definitely, I think countries, especially poor countries, need to have a kind of incentive to introduce carbon pricing. Because just as I mentioned in the presentation, probably I should have mentioned that more clearly. Developing countries, not many developing countries, especially developing countries at the lower end, have adopted carbon pricing measures because they are worried about the potential impact on their economic development. For those developing countries, economic development is really essential. They need to further develop their economy. They need to think about the livelihoods of their general public. And they may not have extra financial and human capacity to introduce a carbon tax or similar measure. Because, for example, ETS in the EU has really taken a long time to finally reach the current pricing level. It is an expensive instrument to be introduced. And moreover, developing countries need to have technologies, and they also need to have support to transit to a greener environment, greener economy with more renewable and new energies. So I would say incentives for other countries, especially for developing countries, should be financial support. And a good achievement, I think a good sign of COP26 is that developed countries have agreed to double adoption funding for developing countries by 2025. At the moment, the funding pledged by developed countries is $100 billion US dollars per year. But for many developing countries, that amount is not enough. So at COP26, finally, developed countries has agreed to increase the financial support to developing countries up to the level of, I think, 1 trillion by 2025. So that can be a good kind of incentive to encourage more developing countries to consider introducing a carbon pricing measure. The second part of your question is, on the other hand, what sort of a possible sanction there can be in case of a non-compliance? I would think border carbon adjustments can be a possible sanction measure. And that's why the EU has introduced one just very, very recently. The EU has strengthened its climate change policies in its new deal, its Green Deal. So with stricter pricing policies and more broadly, stricter carbon or climate change policies, and the EU would be worried that their domestic businesses might be moved away to other countries with softer climate change policies. And then also they may be worried about their domestic businesses that might be put under competitive disadvantage when the EU or its member states import products from other countries with softer or weaker climate policies. So because of all these concerns, I think they wanted to introduce this, to impose this carbon border adjustment as a sanction on non-compliance, or to incentivize other jurisdictions to adopt comparable carbon policy measures. So yeah, I hope I have answered your questions, Wilson. Thank you very much for the questions again. And the next question is from Mr. Hong. Ask me to comment on whether it is relevant to consider carbon pricing together with carbon equity, considering historical emissions of developed countries and the carbon credit, and considering the mitigation efforts and the carbon sinking of some developing countries. I think my answer is definitely yes. Right, of course, we need to consider this. That's why I think in the presentation, and actually in my paper, I have emphasized we need to pay attention to the common but differentiated responsibility principle. And just recently, I read a report or research and finding. And the research report said if we look at historical carbon emissions by countries, and so for example, carbon emissions from the late 19th century, starting actually from 1895 until now, carbon emissions from the US will double the carbon emitted, the amount of carbon emitted by China. So although at the moment, and this is just an example, at the moment, China is the world's largest carbon emitter, and historically it is not. And historically, developed countries have emitted far more carbon than developing countries. And historically, and still now, and the richest persons in the wealthiest countries have emitted far more carbon than ordinary individuals from developing countries. So I would definitely agree with you on considering carbon credit equity, and also some other issues with regard to the interests and the needs of developing countries. I hope this has answered your question, and so thank you very much. Okay, I see some comment about border carbon adjustment. Really, that depends on how one looks at the issue. I saw a comment in the chat saying border carbon adjustment is not a tariff. This may be right. However, based on some other articles on comments I read, and still there are researchers who think carbon border adjustments effectively, essentially, are like tariffs. They are designed to, as I said, to equalize costs incurred by domestic producers with those incurred by producers from other jurisdictions. It is overall, I wouldn't really make a further comment on whether carbon border adjustments should be considered tariffs or not. But I want to say, over time, or maybe at least in the short term, border carbon adjustments may be needed as a kind of a proxy sanction on non-compliance to promote and to facilitate the implementation of a global carbon pricing framework. But in the long run, it is not the best solution. It is not a stable solution. In the long run, we should rely on an internationally coordinated effort to combat climate change, because it is a global threat to all people on the planet. Sorry, I'm reading questions. I'm not sure if I am able to answer all the questions given the time just left. Yeah, for the last one, yeah, definitely for sure. I would be very happy to share with you my presentation slides and also my paper. So Richard, which question do you want me to answer? Because I saw quite a number of questions right now.
Yeah, I see. I see. Let me just look. What about the one looking at the rather detailed question, the second last one, the necessity for border carbon measures under a multilateral carbon price agreement?
Yeah, the question relates to border carbon adjustments. These measures might still be adopted by the participants of such a multilateral carbon pricing agreement. as long as the participants are limited and the trade-off. I think that is quite right. Because if we both the framework on the IMF proposal, basically you just couldn't prevent carbon leakage, and you also couldn't reduce the concerns of some countries, jurisdictions such as like the EU about competitiveness. So still, that may be possible. Some jurisdictions would prefer to have a separate board carbon adjustment measure as a safeguard against non-compliance. And that is really, really possible. Because if at the initial stage, and the global minimum carbon pricing framework is just limited to several countries. Also, I think that may another reason is for the necessity of having a separate board carbon adjustment for countries and the jurisdictions targeted in the IMF proposal, at least at the initial stage, is that if some countries' performance in the past have made other participants, other countries quite worried about the credibility of an international climate change agreement. So for example, the Paris Agreement and also the Kyoto Protocol. Sorry to say that, but the US, as we say, didn't really participate in the Kyoto Protocol. And for the Paris Agreement, the government under the Trump administration withdrew from the agreement. And then after Biden came to the office, and the US was back to the Paris Agreement again. So you see this kind of back and forth is not very credible. And because we don't have sanctions and international environmental law in general and climate change law in particular, and then that might be a reason why countries, jurisdictions wanted to have a kind of safeguard against non-compliance. Yeah, for that, I think I would agree with you on that. Because with a global minimum carbon price based on the IMF proposal, we just couldn't prevent all those issues, especially carbon leakage, competitiveness, and finally non-compliance from happening. Yes, I hope this has answered your question, but thank you very much for the question.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Yan, for the presentation. I found it most informing. And looking at the number of questions we've got, people have obviously paying close attention, and some of them more familiar with the area than I am. But I've learned a lot from it, and I can see a lot of work's gone into it. It's a very complex topic. You've given us excellent food for thought, and I think a good framework to consider the difficulties and the complexity. I can't say I'm going away thinking this is all going to be done easily and sorted out.
No, not at all.
So, but you have to start, and it's clear that really serious thinking is going on, including by yourself. Thanks. I meant to mention that before, but for your reassurance, we've already got your PowerPoint slides, and we'll make those available for people to look at online through the AIIFL TLRP website. And I think you said you do have a paper and you'll be able to provide a link for that. Is that right?
Yes, I will send a copy of my paper after the seminar.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so then people can just download a PDF of the paper as well. Well, look, we look forward to having you back again to do another presentation, whether on this topic or something more directly related to taxation law in China and these sorts of measures. I did note, and I'm not asking for any comment here, but clearly a number of pilot programs are running in China, as you know, is the usual practice to test these things out. So perhaps in 12 months' time, it might be good to to look at how those are working out and where we may stand with them. But with that, I'll say thank you, and we're just a little bit over time, and we'll look forward to seeing you again via Zoom, or perhaps one of these days, one day, actually live here on stage in Hong Kong. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for organizing this seminar again. Thank you.
Okay, and I should say thank you for all of the very good questions. Thank you for everybody who's raised those. Okay, we'll finish it there. Thank you. Bye.